But then you got to this extraordinary place, and there's just thousands and thousands of turtles in the water surrounding you.
G'day and welcome to the Reef in Focus podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the health and specific management of the world's largest coral reef system, the Great Barrier Reef. My name's Lincoln Batoli and we're recording this episode in sunny North Queensland once again on Woolgarooga Bar and neighbouring Bindle country. Our guest today is a familiar face, but before we divulge who's in the hot seat, a little bit of context. This week we're diving into the world of the ocean's most iconic and ancient creatures, the sea turtle. Now, these incredible reptiles have been around for millions of years, but like so many species, they're not immune to the challenges of climate change and other disturbances. And in this episode, we're taking you behind the scenes of the Great Barrier Reef Turtle Research Program that's all about protecting these vulnerable animals now and into the future. And joining me, as I said, is someone who knows a thing or two about the program and turtles in particular, Dr. Mark Reed, the director of our Reef Joint Field Management Program. He's a turtle expert, a veteran of turtle conservation for the past 35 years, and even affectionately known as Dr. Turtle. Hello, mate. Welcome back.
Thanks, Lincoln. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Look, plenty of questions to get into around this program, but firstly, how did it all start? The affinity with turtles, the work with reptiles. Can you take us back 35 years?
Actually, I might even go back a little bit further than that. So when I was a little kid growing up in Rockhampton, while a lot of kids might have been playing with other things, I was fascinated with catching snakes and lizards. So, I caught my first lizard when I was about 5 years old and then progressed to snakes. And, I used to go down the local creek and there just happened to be turtles in the creek as well. So just really developed an interest in reptiles. Once again, while I was at school, kids might have been playing handball. I was out the back catching skinks and other lizards. So sort of fast forward, while I was growing up and going through high school, I just developed this continuing interest in reptiles and science. And so thought to myself, look, I want to be a ranger. So I ended up going to uni, doing a zoology degree. And as I was doing that, I had the amazing luck to work as a volunteer at the Queensland Museum in their reptile section under this extraordinary bloke called Pat Cooper. And he was an amazing mentor. And through Pat, I ended up meeting the world famous Dr. Cole Olympus.
Yep.
And he invited me out on a Moreton Bay to catch turtles. And we're out there, had this amazing day catching turtles. And at the end of the day, we're going home in the boat and he turns to me and says, "So Mark, what do you think you want to do with yourself?" And I said, "I'm going to do an honours degree, Cole." And he said, "What are you going to do it on?" And I said, "I thought I might do it on sea snakes." And he looked at me and said, "Do you want to do one on turtles?" And I went, "Yep." And that's where it started.
That was it?
That was it.
Now, if we hark back to season one, you also gave us a bit of background on some very important work with crocs up in the top end. This episode is specifically around the Green Turtle program that we have here at the Reef Authority. A big picture question to start with. Can you give us a quick overview of the Green Turtle? Why are they so important to a healthy ecosystem?
Yep, no worries at all. I mean, as per your introduction, these animals they first appeared in the fossil record a couple of 100 million years ago. So, just contextualise that, they were sort of getting around in our oceans sort of before the true age of dinosaurs. So they're the ancient mariners of the sea. We've got 7 species of marine turtle in the world. The Great Barrier Reef is lucky enough to host 6 of those, 4 of which nest in the Great Barrier Reef as well.
Wow.
So we are super lucky. We're privileged, really, to be able to support some of the world's best protected and most robust population of those species. Turtles play a really critical ecological role. The green turtle is the only truly herbivorous turtle, and so they graze on seagrass meadows and algae. They'll eat things like sea cucumbers and sea anemones if they can,
Yep.
But generally speaking, they're herbivorous. So they're grazers. So they play the same role as, grazers on the land. They're sort of controlling the seagrass meadows and sort of keeping them in check. They also play a really critical role when they go up on the islands to lay their eggs. They move about a metre cubed of sand when they're making their nest. So
Just one turtle?
Just one turtle moves a metre cubed of sand. So they actually play a really crucial role as what we call bioturbators, or bioeroders. So they turn the beach over and they can actually cause erosion. So they play a function, in the ocean,
Yep.
but they also play a function on land.
Yeah, wow. So from those trips up north, is there something or a specific story, moment in particular that stands out to you among many, I'm sure?
So I think one of the really early memories for me was, when I was getting, I suppose, giving the opportunity to work with turtles, is I got sent on a trip to Rain Island for the very first time, and we're going back a few decades here. And so back in those days, you hopped on a boat in Cairns and then you flogged your way up the coast for like 3 days before you got to Rain Island.
Yeah.
So a long and fairly uncomfortable trip. But then you got to this extraordinary place. And you're sitting or standing on the boat looking at Rain Island, which is pretty small, and there's just thousands and thousands of turtles in the water surrounding you. And, as a sort of young scientist coming up through the ranks, to be given that really unique opportunity to be in that extraordinary place, looking at these animals, just sort of, really resonated
Yeah.
with me. And then, Rain Island's extraordinary in terms of seabirds as well. So you sort of had this multiple layers of just like, oh wow moments, like, oh wow, there's lots of turtles. Oh wow, there's lots of seabirds here.
Yeah.
And then, one day we were moving from Rain Island up to a nearby place called Malta Cay, and we're cruising along this boat, and there was a whale shark in the water beside the boat. And so, we slowed down, and this whale shark actually came up beside the boat and started to rub itself on, the hull of this vessel. So, here's me at a sort of 20-year-old on this extraordinary adventure
Yeah.
to this amazing place, just having one after another of jaw-dropping experiences.
Unreal.
And, just sort of really, I'd always say that I've got the best job in the world because I've been so lucky to be able to do that for my work. And, I get to go to, and I've get to go to amazing places and do amazing things and contribute to leaving an enduring legacy. Lincoln, I just don't think you can get better than that.
No, it doesn't sound like it at all.
Another time we were going to Rain Island, as we were approaching it, there were actually 3 whale sharks feeding on the surface between Rain Island and the next reef down. So here we are in sort of 300 metres of water, 3 big whale sharks feeding on the surface, and all of us, snorkeling gear on, over the side, and to be able to swim with one of these was a really big animal, like
Yeah.
it was probably 10 metres. To be able to swim with something that big and to get the appreciation of, when it's swimming along the surface, its tail's going through an arc of 20 to 30 feet. There's this whopping great big tail. And it's just,
Wow.
oh my goodness.
Yeah. And how big is that in context of the boat that you're on?
So we're on a 45-foot boat.
Yeah.
And so this was a sort of a 30-odd feet whale shark.
Unreal. Can you give us a background, I guess, from that on the actual green turtle research program? What sparked its beginnings and how long has it been running for?
Yeah, so we've obviously been studying turtles in terms of the Queensland Government and the Reef Authority for a long time, and based on that long-term monitoring, particularly at Rain Island, we recognised that there was a few problems. We weren't getting as many turtles coming back to lay their eggs. We weren't getting a lot of turtles coming out of many of those nests, and because of rising temperatures, we had concerns that we might be producing a lot of female hatchlings. Now, turtles and some other reptile species are really interesting because it's not the genetic contribution from mum and dad that determines the sex of the hatchling. It's primarily due to the environment and particularly strongly influenced from incubation temperature.
Yep.
So as temperatures warm, we're concerned about producing a lot of females. So we had some of those signals coming down the pipeline. But what we didn't have is we didn't have a lot of research happening out on the foraging ground, so where the turtles spend most of their lives,
Yep.
and particularly looking at the full suite of males, females, big ones, little ones. So that was, in many respects, that was the sort of genesis of the Great Barrier Reef Green Turtle Research Program, is saying, hey, we have an information gap here. Let's design or develop a program of works that allow us to get better information about that part of their life, and then capture that information and then think about what that means for management.
Yeah, okay.
So that's effectively the genesis of the project.
And how long ago was that?
We started that project about 6 years ago.
Yep.
And one of the things we're really, really keen on when we started is that, we are doing this work on Aboriginal land. And so working collaboratively with them in partnership to co-design, co-deliver the project was really, really important.
Yep.
And so it also allowed us to get that extraordinary, melding of traditional ecological knowledge and Western science to be able to tell a more comprehensive story.
Yeah, wow. And you touched on some of the threats, rising temperatures affecting the sex of the species. Is there other threats that sort of contribute to their vulnerability, if you like, as well?
Yeah, so certainly things like, coastal development, particularly near areas where they lay their eggs, is certainly a challenge. Some of the degradation of their habitats, whether that be beaches or seagrass meadows. Um, people, driving their boats too fast near the areas where they feed seagrass meadows.
Yeah.
And particularly there's some sort of predators of their eggs when they come up and lay them. Feral pigs are a real problem in
Yeah.
some parts of Australia as well. So there's sort of multiple layers of threats that we need to address when we're thinking about maintaining healthy populations of sea turtles.
Yeah, okay. It's a great segue into our next question. Looking at these threats, what does a typical day for the officers working on the Green Turtle Research Program look like?
We've been running field trips into the Northern Great Barrier Reef and up into the Torres Straits. So those guys will be jumping on board a boat and they'll be working very, very closely with the traditional owners. And they'll spend up to 10 days every day going out and catching turtles and then capturing all the necessary information on those turtles that then help us, as I say, sort of tell that story.
Yeah.
So, like any project, there's many contributors.
Yeah, okay. And I guess those of us that are landlocked see some of these incredible photos and videos, etc., that come back, but it's really a massive effort, isn't it? Because it's quite an isolated sort of place up there, and as you said, the logistics don't just happen. There's a lot of planning that goes into something like that.
Oh, and totally. Like, trying to get a boat from, Cairns to far northern Great Barrier Reef in itself is an exercise. And
Yeah.
then to be able to to get sort of 8 to 10 people converge in the same place at the same time to get that boat and then go out and spend that time is really important.
Yep.
And Lincoln, like any work we do, particularly in remote areas, we've also got to have that really, really good focus on safety because, we're in remote locations, we're working with machinery,
Yeah.
we're jumping off boats to catch turtles. So making sure that everything is done really safely, everyone understands what we're doing and why we're doing it is a really key part of what we do.
Yeah, that's right. Can you tell us a little bit more, Mark, around how new technology or research is sort of further enhancing the program?
Yeah, so, over the last, many decades, we've been, experimenting and getting more technology around the ability to track animals through time and space, so transmitters. So with this particular project, we'd done a lot of work on green turtles in terms of satellite tracking adult females to understand how they use space around a nesting ground, and then when they'd finished, where they went in
Yeah.
terms of back to their foraging ground. But we'd not had the same focus on adult males. Now, under an environment where we're getting concerns around feminisation, that's likely to mean less males coming through in the population. So it makes them disproportionately more important. But we actually knew very little about them.
Yeah.
So part of this project was to go and target adult males that were going to get ready to breed that season, fit them with a satellite transmitter, and then let them go to see what they did. And the story was actually really fascinating. We put out 52 satellite transmitters.
Yeah.
And we were fully expecting a lot of turtles to actually leave their foraging ground and go to another place to mate with the females.
Yeah.
What we found is actually quite a lot of them didn't actually leave their foraging grounds at all. They simply, they courted the females in their neighbourhood,
Yeah.
effectively.
How big is their neighbourhood?
The neighbourhood's, sort of tens of square kilometres. Whilst others did actually leave their home, their neighbourhood, to go somewhere else to meet up with the females. So all of a sudden we've got this different view about how adult males use space through time. And from a management perspective, that's really valuable because we can now go, okay, based on that information, do we have enough protection in place for adult males that are going to be more and more important for the population?
Yeah, wow. And as you said, that's not something that you expected. Is there certain factors that cause one male to stay and another to go?
We don't know. And that's, in many ways, that's one of the really interesting
Yeah.
things about the work we do is that as you start getting more and more involved, you realise there's actually so much more to learn.
Yeah. And it just highlights, as you said, the importance of the work moving forward. You mentioned it briefly previously that there's a strong community element and traditional owners are helping to design the program. What does that mean? How are they involved specifically in the project?
So I suppose from the very early on, we reached out to the traditional owners and said, hey, we've got this, we've been able to get this funding to do work on turtles. We'd really like to do that work in your country. And in particular, we specifically said we wanted to work with a group in the far northern Great Barrier Reef, and we wanted to work with a group in the Torres Straits. For the Torres Straits, we've been working with them for quite a few decades on the Rain Island recovery project, so we had an established relationship. But we didn't have the same sort of relationship with the guys in the far northern Great Barrier Reef. So we reached out nice and early and said, hey, this is what we want to do. This is why we want to do it. We really want to work with you.
Yep.
And they were just super enthusiastic and excited. Like they came on board. We sat down and said, right, how do you think we should do this? Where do you think's the right places to go to find turtles?
Yeah.
And they gave us all that local information. And then from there on, every time we went out on a boat, we had a cultural advisor on board, and we also had some land and sea rangers as well.
Yep.
So once again, sort of bringing that extraordinary focus on traditional ecological knowledge and Western science just sort of produced that extraordinary harmony that allowed us to tell a more fulsome story.
And without that, I suppose you're not exactly flying blind, but being able to draw on that local knowledge, particularly where the turtles are, must be such an eye-opening experience.
Oh, absolutely. And also to be able to sort of sit with traditional owners on country and have them, tell those extraordinary stories about the relationship they have with country and
Yeah.
with elements of country like turtles. And, my understanding is that a lot of groups, consider turtles to be really important culturally. They're sort of they're woven into some of their songs, they're woven into some of their dances, they're woven into a lot of their art. So to be able to get that sort of those multiple layers of information and resolution,
Yeah.
it's humbling.
Yeah, I can imagine. Unbelievable. Now, we often, I guess we know from the Great Barrier Reef's perspective that climate change is the greatest threat to not only the Great Barrier Reef, but all coral reefs worldwide. But it's obviously a lot more complex than that, and it affects different sort of ecosystems in different ways. You touched on it earlier around the incubation process, but how else does climate change affect turtle populations?
At multiple levels would be the best answer. So just sort of going back to that temperature-dependent sex determination we talked about earlier, turtles are super cool because there's this thing we call the pivotal temperature, which is a theoretical temperature that will produce about 50% females and 50% males.
Yeah.
And if you go above that, you produce more females. If you go below that, you produce more males. Now, the really cool thing is that pivotal temperature changes with latitude. So what we might have at Rain Island, for example, would be probably a couple of degrees warmer than what we might have, say, in southeast Queensland.
Yeah, okay.
So these really extraordinary sort of evolutionary changes. But climate change affects the seagrass meadows that the green turtles rely upon. Climate change affects the interactions between things like the coral reefs and the sort of seagrass meadows and algal beds that will be amongst coral reefs that the turtles rely upon. There's all these changes that can affect them at multiple stages of their life cycle.
Yeah.
And sort of ocean currents are another big one. So once again, there's just so many cool things about turtles. I could just go on for days and days. But one of the really cool things is that when the turtle lays an egg, drops into the nest, and the little embryo starts developing.
Yep.
Now, depending on the incubation temperature, some sort of 8 to 10 weeks later, the hatchling will actually hatch out of the egg, and it'll then spend a couple of days digging its way through the sand to the surface of the sand. They'll then sit as a group just beneath the sand surface with their noses basically just under the sand.
Yeah.
And what they're waiting for is the drop in temperature as we go from day to night that signals that nighttime has fallen and the chances of predators are probably reduced. So that's when they all burst out of the nest.
Wow.
They come out of the nest and they scurry down the beach, and then they hit the water, and they then they go for what's like a swimming frenzy for sort of 24, 48, 72 hours, and takes them out into these big currents. Now, for some species, that means they get into the Eastern Australian current and they actually go all the way across the Pacific to the coast of South America, off
As a
Chile,
baby.
as a hatchling, off Chile and Peru, and then they'll sort of mature over there until they're sort of subadults, and then they'll come all the way back into Queensland waters, and then they'll take up residence on a foraging
It's
ground.
incredible.
So that's mainly loggerheads, but green turtles do exactly the same thing. They go out into these big currents, they're feeding on algae mats and things like that, and then somewhere around 7 to 10 years old, they'll actually come out of that oceanic phase and come into an inshore feeding area or a coral reef. And so it's just, thinking about all of those different life stages and the things that can impact turtles really means that we've actually got to have a layered management approach if we're looking after the whole population.
I guess it's not insurmountable odds, but it's fairly incredible. What are the odds for a hatchling to survive to maturity to come back and lay?
So the best estimate we have of that is 1 in 1,000.
Wow.
And so for early on in the days, we didn't really realise the relationship. We didn't understand where the turtles went and when they came back to foraging grounds. So I mentioned earlier on, I was lucky enough to work with this extraordinary mentor, Dr. Cole Limpus. So in the late 70s and early 80s, he and a bunch of his researchers sat down and they scoot marked over 250,000 turtle hatchlings. So what I mean is that the turtles have a series of scales around the edge of their shell, and if you cut those scales out, they don't grow back. So you can actually give each turtle a unique sequence to identify it from location and the year that it was hatched. And then they let these turtles go, and for a long time, we never saw them. We never saw a scoop-marked hatchling. And for me, this is a really extraordinary moment because I caught one of the first ever scoop-marked hatchlings on a foraging ground trip in Moreton Bay.
Wow.
It was either 1990 or 1991. And so based on that long-term monitoring focus, we were able to understand how long it took for turtles to go from hatchling to actually starting to come back into our foraging grounds. So that sort of long-term dedication, that long-term focus on monitoring it's really important when you're dealing with an animal that can probably live greater than 80 years old.
Yeah, it's incredible, mate. I could listen to those stories all day. I really could. Can you tell us, I know apart from the monitoring, there's also been some elements of remediation and things like that. Are there other elements to the project that are just as important?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit earlier about the potential impacts of climate change and the concerns around feminisation of hatchlings. So one of the things we really wanted to test is can you actually deliberately cool a nesting beach to try and influence that incubation temperature? But we made a decision early on that trying to do that on a remote location up on Cape York was going to be logistically really difficult. So we actually made the decision to actually do that work at Monrepos near Bundaberg on a different species of turtles, but the techniques would be applicable. So we worked with Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service and we trialled two different methods to try and cool the nests. One, we actually did some freshwater sprinkling of nest areas. And then others, we actually built shade cloth enclosures and put the nests of the eggs in there to see whether that would make a difference.
Yep.
And it was, once again, the results were really important because it showed that with different strengths of shade cloth, you could actually lower the incubation temperature to a point where you're producing a higher proportion of males.
Yeah, okay.
And the sprinklers also worked, but they were nowhere near as effective. So straight away, we've tested a couple of different methods that we can now think about. Can we upscale those to apply them at the sort of whole of nesting beach scale rather than just an experimental plot?
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question, I guess, without putting you on the spot. Is it practical to scale something like that, particularly given the locations are so remote?
I think the answer is probably going to be a bit of yes and no. At
Yeah.
some locations, say for example, Heron Island is a really significant location for green turtles to nest and loggerheads. So that's the location where you probably could successfully employ either sprinkling or shade cloth because people are there.
Mm.
In the more remote locations, that would be probably more challenging, but we are actually trialling the use of shade cloth enclosures on a remote beach up in far northern Queensland this season
Yeah, wow.
to see whether or not we can actually make that difference.
And there is a third element to this as well, isn't there? We've spoken about the foraging grounds. We've looked at the shading of the nesting areas, but I understand there's wide scale mapping you're taking to the skies. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've certainly over the years we've worked out that this population of green turtles probably nests on beaches that start, about Princess Charlotte Bay, so north of Cooktown,
Yep.
and go all the way up into the Torres Straits. But we actually hadn't done a contemporary assessment of that nesting since the mid 90s. And so we had no real idea. We'd done a lot of focus on a couple of places like Rain Island, but all the rest of these areas didn't really know. So we took to the skies. We worked with an extraordinary contractor who was able to fit like the state of the art cameras to the outside of his aircraft. And then he was able to fly mainland beaches and a whole bunch of islands and cays, actually mapping the beaches. And that then allowed us to look at whether or not we actually had turtle nesting crawl marks on the beach.
Yep.
We could then count those nesting crawls. We could identify the species based on the size and the configuration of the nesting crawls.
Yep.
So we were able to get that broad scale census work, which was totally amazing. But not just that. With the technology, we're actually then also we're able to map the islands both in terms of their size, the shape of the beach, the topography of the island, so how tall the island was, but also the vegetation on the island. And that is particularly important because we could actually then map those islands that are sort of topographically higher than some of the nearby islands, because they're going to provide that sort of long-term refuge under a climate change sea level rise model. So as managers, that might mean we would probably, we can then think about, okay, there's a turtle nesting area over here that's really low lying and it's going to be threatened by sea level rise.
Mm.
Could we think about intervening there and actually moving those eggs from that location over to this island, which is higher and going to be more stable over time? So much of this project is about improving our understanding to then informing management actions for the future to look after these green turtles.
Yeah, well, and it's incredible that we're looking at stuff like that. And I imagine that like you said, it's a fine line around intervention and making sure it's successful. But it must be, as we touched on, very heartening from your point of view, overseeing the project and seeing that there is solutions, if you like, to an ongoing problem.
It really is, but also it just keeps on coming back to the fact that there are so many people involved with the custodianship of turtles. The Reef Authority plays one part, the Queensland Government through Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service plays another part.
Yeah.
But we have this extraordinary, multi-generational input from the traditional owners. And in many ways, trying to break down the barriers and recognise that we're all part of the stewards to look after the turtles for future generations is truly heartening. And for me, thinking about how do we translate that information to influence kids, influence that next generation of decision makers. So we're investing in those people who are going to influence what happens in the future.
What else can you tell us, I guess, where to next in line with these trials for the program?
So probably for us, there's a couple of things. Number one, there's still a lot of the analysis of these results to come through. So that's the sort of next really crucial piece for us, is waiting for those results to then be able to tell that more full story. But probably one of the more important bits is we really need to make sure that we're closing the cycle with our traditional owner partners, and that the information, we're working with them to then produce stories that they can take back into community to educate the kids, the next generation of decision makers.
Yeah.
So that's the final part of this puzzle for us, is to do that socialisation component, working really closely with our traditional owner partners, and saying, you know, what's going to be most relevant for you in terms of being able to socialise the results of this project? How do we do that? And then how do we actually operationalise that out on country?
And we have seen, I guess, initial results, if you like, from the program so far. Can you enlighten us with some of those, or give us a bit of a taste of how successful it's been?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the parts of the project we started out from was we wanted to know about the foraging ground population of this, population of green turtles. And so we're trying to understand things like, what's the ratio of males to females? What's the ratio of big turtles to little turtles? Because think about managing a herd of cattle. If you're a farmer, you want to know what's happening with your beasts. You want to know how quickly they're growing. You want to know whether you've got the right mix of males and females.
Yep.
You want to make sure that you've got the right mix of young animals and older animals. It's exactly the same when you're looking at wildlife populations. So, part of this project was to go out there and spend a lot of time at particular locations catching turtles so we could actually start to build up that picture of what the population is structured like.
Yep.
Now, one of the things we found in both of those locations is we have a we have a very low number of juveniles in both the Northern Great Barrier Reef populations and the Torres Strait populations. And that's a little bit of an alarming signal for us because we were expecting to see far more smaller animals
Yep.
compared to bigger animals. The other thing is that with the juveniles, we were able to sex the animals, tell whether they're males or females.
Yep.
And of those that we sexed, there was a disproportionately high number of females. So we're actually clearly seeing that signal of feminisation coming
Yeah.
through that work. So we've still got to unpack that information and do some further analyses, but that sort of initial glimpse into what we found really sort of backs up that it was important to do this project and then think about, okay, what could we do to try and change that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, from those initial findings, what does that mean from a management point of view? How do we look at how we regulate the marine park moving forward? Do we look at different options? Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so we touched on a little bit earlier talking about the initial concerns around Rain Island and that sort of lack of turtle hatchlings coming from the beach. So we actually think that some of those early signals was the concerns. It was, they were the things that we were looking at going, I'm wondering what that's going to mean for the population, in 20, 30 years' time. So we're now at that point where we're seeing that low level of juveniles. So that's the signal that's been carried through for, at least a couple of decades. So as managers, what that means is we've now got to look really carefully at those nesting beaches and say, okay, what can we do on the nesting beaches to increase the number of hatchlings that are coming off those beaches?
Yep.
I know I talk a lot about Rain Island, but Rain Island actually represents about 90% of the nesting for this particular green turtle population. So it's very, very important.
Yeah.
So what we realised in the sort of mid-90s is that when turtles were laying their nests at Rain Island, often they were laying them in an area where the tide was coming up and then flooding the nests. So that actually kills the little embryos developing inside the eggs. So we started actually in sort of 2013, we put a bobcat on Rain Island and did a little bit of what we call a beach reprofiling exercise where we pushed the beach up push sand up over the beach to increase the height of the beach.
Yep.
To
Above the tide level.
Above the tide level, and then we went back in at 2014 and then 2017 and then 2019, and we've now reprofiled about 22% of the beach on Rain Island and lifted that beach above the tidal inundation level. And we've been now monitoring those locations since then, and we've found that turtles nest successfully in those locations. They produce hatchlings in higher numbers compared to some of the control areas nearby. So as a management agency, intervening on nesting beaches is certainly one of the things we can do. It's complicated, it's logistically challenging, it's
Yeah.
expensive, but these are all the things that we've got to be thinking about as modern marine park management as managers. What are the management levers we can pull,
Yeah.
and how do we actually deploy them at the most important areas to try and get the best
Yeah,
outcomes?
and it must be heartening, I guess, to see positive results, for such an important project that we set.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, once again, sort of talking about the privilege of the work we do. That's
Mm.
one of the nice things, is to be able to see the results of those sorts of projects, but also to see the results, like when you make a decision to intervene, to then actually see that carried through to influence the results.
So to put it, as you said, the oceans are changing, if you like, and turtles are facing challenges, which we mentioned. But in a global context, Australia really is at the forefront of conservation and management moving forward.
We certainly are. Like, we're really fortunate because certainly at that national scale, we have some of the most robust and best protections in place for species like marine turtles. That's also, the protection of their nesting beaches, but also the waters that they swim through and forage in. So there's a national recovery plan that sort of directs how we should be thinking about protecting marine turtles into the future, which really helps us sort of set that direction. If you then drop down to the state level, Queensland has a Queensland Marine Turtle Conservation Strategy that once again really sets our directions. What are our priorities by species, by locations? And that just enables us as managers to look at that and go, okay, where should we direct our resources?
Yeah.
And for the Great Barrier Reef Green Turtle Research Program, we have been extraordinarily privileged because we were funded through Reef Trust from our DQ partners. They recognised a long time ago how important turtles were to Queensland and to the national landscape. And they came on board and they provided us with the funding for this really important project. It's sort of, in many ways, it just really epitomises the fact that it requires multiple layers and multiple partners to successfully deliver a project of this scope and scale. And so, from the funders all the way through to the people who deliver the on-ground results, go out there and catch the turtles, there's just so many different stages and players to be able to deliver this successfully.
And we've touched on it a little bit in previous episodes, apart from the colourful coral and maybe clownfish, like there's nothing more emblematic, I think, in my opinion, than, a turtle gliding through, crystal clear water on the Great Barrier Reef. It's probably something that people perhaps don't realise, but while we have you, what can people do, in their own backyard to assist with something like this?
Yeah, excuse me. I think this is where turtles provide a really unique opportunity for us, because when you're trying to convince people to conserve and protect, areas like the Great Barrier Reef, sometimes getting them to realise why that's so important is actually really difficult. Turtles are amazing because people can go to a nesting beach like Monrepo and they can actually see one of these ancient mariners of the ocean crawling up the beach and then laying its eggs and then actually going back into the water. They can see that, they can participate in that, and that then allows us an opportunity to link the conservation and the other things we're doing to that particular event to make it resonate with the people.
Yeah.
So for us, so much of our work has to be about how do we convince people that the things that we all do when we're out there on the marine park are important in terms of making that little bit of difference. Being really responsible with your litter when you're out there on your boat, because green turtles also feed on jellyfish, and a plastic bag floating in the ocean looks just like a jellyfish. So being responsible with your litter. When you're out there enjoying the marine park, think about, go slow for those below. If you're across the seagrass meadow or coral reef, think about there are other animals using that environment. So being responsible in how you do that. If you're out on the marine park at night close to a nesting beach, shield your lights, because that might attract the little hatchlings to your boat, and then they'll just become, unfortunately, food for things like trevally.
Yeah.
And if you're on the mainland or locations like that, think about when you're enjoying the beach, possibly walking your dog, once again, Be safe, be responsible, don't let your dog harass the turtles or the hatchlings. It's just those kinds of things. It's the little things that you and me and everyone else who enjoys the marine park can do to make that little bit of difference.
Yeah, wow. It, as you said, mate, the ocean is changing and it's such a shared responsibility. I could talk to you all afternoon about this, I really could. Maybe next time when we get the results, I might come to you.
Thank you. As always, it's a great opportunity to be able to come and tell some extraordinary stories about the amazing work we do.
Always appreciate your time, mate. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.